"Stop acting innocent," she said with a calm smile, but the way she looked at me after that made me realize I'd already crossed a line I never noticed. It started like any other ordinary day, one of those moments that doesn't promise anything different, nothing that suggests life is about to shift in a subtle but irreversible way. I remember walking into the place with a calm, almost mechanical sense of routine. The air inside was quiet, slightly cool, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and something floral, something soft that didn't quite belong to the otherwise structured environment. People moved around with purpose, speaking in low, measured tones, as if even sound had rules here. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. Not a conversation, not a moment, not a memory worth keeping. And then she appeared. At first, it wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden silence in the room, no obvious reaction from others. It was just the way the atmosphere seemed to adjust itself around her presence. She walked in with quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't ask for attention but receives it anyway. Her posture was composed, steady, like someone who had learned long ago how to carry herself through rooms full of uncertainty. She looked to be in her early 40s, graceful in a way that felt natural, not performed. There was a softness in her expression, but also something firm beneath it, like calm water hiding depth underneath. Our eyes met briefly. It wasn't a dramatic stare, just a moment, small enough that someone else might have missed it, but long enough that I didn't forget it. Her gaze wasn't intrusive. It was observant, measured, almost like she was noticing not just me, but the way I stood, the way I avoided standing too confidently, the way I tried to look unbothered. I looked away first. That alone annoyed me later. She began speaking to someone nearby, her voice calm and steady, carrying an effortless authority. Even without trying, she seemed to anchor the space around her. People listened when she spoke, not because she demanded it, but because it felt natural to do so. A little later, circumstances brought us closer. A shared task, a brief exchange, something simple that should have been forgettable. She handed something toward me. Papers, maybe an object I needed. My fingers brushed hers for just a second. It should have meant nothing, but it did. Her hand was warm, steady, unhurried. There was no hesitation in her movement, unlike mine, which felt slightly too aware of everything, too conscious of time, space, proximity. She didn't react to the touch. Neither did I. Not outwardly. But something inside me paused like a thought that forgot how to finish itself. When I looked up again, she was already focused elsewhere, as if nothing had happened. That, somehow, made it linger more, because it felt like I was the only one who noticed. The rest of the room continued as normal. Conversations resumed. Chairs shifted. Papers moved. Life stayed unchanged. But for me, something had already tilted slightly off balance, and I didn't yet understand why. The second meeting didn't feel like an event at first. It felt like continuation, something slipping quietly out of the first encounter and finding its way back into reality, as if it had never truly left. This time, the setting was more relaxed, less formal, the kind of environment where conversations stretch a little longer, where silence doesn't feel awkward, just present. I told myself I was calm, normal, unaffected, but I noticed her before I even realized I was looking for her. She entered the space with the same quiet certainty as before. No rush in her movements. No unnecessary gestures. Just presence. Controlled, composed, almost effortless. And again, without any clear reason, the atmosphere felt slightly different when she was in it. This time, she acknowledged me more directly. Not just a glance, this time she spoke to me. Her voice carried the same calmness I remembered, but there was something slightly different underneath it. A subtle edge of familiarity, like she had already formed an impression of me and was now simply refining it. We exchanged a few sentences, simple ones, nothing important on the surface. But I found myself paying attention not just to her words, but to the way she said them. The small pauses between phrases, the slight tilt of her head when she observed my reactions. It was unsettling in a quiet way. Then, in the middle of what should have been an ordinary exchange, she paused. Just slightly. Her eyes stayed on me a fraction longer than expected. And then she said it. "Stop acting innocent." Her tone wasn't harsh. There was no anger in it, no judgment. If anything, it almost sounded like amusement, soft control, but unmistakably aware. Still, the words landed differently than the tone suggested. For a moment, I didn't respond. I think I even smiled, lightly, trying to dismiss it as nothing. Something casual, something I could shrug off. But I felt it stay. Not in the room. In me. Because the way she said it didn't feel random. It felt like she had noticed something I hadn't admitted even to myself. Something about the way I behaved around her. Too careful, too aware, too hesitant in ways I couldn't explain. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Instead, she simply continued the conversation as if she had only made a passing remark. As if she hadn't just shifted something inside me, without effort. A little later, there was another small moment. We stood closer than before, looking at something shared between us. Papers, a screen, a task that required proximity. She leaned slightly in to point something out. Her shoulder brushed mine. It wasn't intentional. It didn't last long, but it was enough. The warmth of that brief contact spread through me in a way I wasn't prepared for. Not because it was intimate, but because it was natural for her. Uncalculated, unbothered. For her, it was nothing. For me, it became everything I kept replaying afterward. And that was the problem. She could say something like that, "Stop acting innocent," and walk away unchanged. But I couldn't, because I didn't know anymore whether I was acting or just being seen too clearly for the first time. After that second encounter, something subtle changed in the way I moved through the space. Not outwardly, no one would have noticed, but internally, there was a quiet awareness that hadn't been there before. It was like a thread had been pulled loose, and now everything felt slightly more sensitive, slightly more connected to her presence than I was comfortable admitting. I started noticing her before she spoke. The sound of her footsteps became familiar in a way I didn't expect. Calm, steady, unhurried. Not loud enough to announce her arrival, but distinct enough that my attention would shift without permission. Even when I was focused on something else, there was a part of me that tracked her movement without effort. And then there was her voice. It wasn't louder than others. It didn't demand attention, but it carried a kind of quiet authority that made it impossible to ignore. When she spoke, people listened, not because they had to, but because her words had weight, experience, thought behind them. And sometimes when she spoke to me directly, that weight felt personal. Over the next few interactions, something started to shift in her tone. Still composed, still controlled, but there were moments of lightness now. A subtle teasing edge that hadn't been there before. As if she was beginning to test how I reacted to her. I told myself it meant nothing. That I was imagining patterns where there were none. But the problem with attention is that once you start receiving it consistently from someone, you begin to notice even the smallest changes. One afternoon, we were both working on something together. The room was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but focused. She was beside me, close enough that I could sense her presence more than see it. At one point, she leaned slightly forward to adjust or point something out. Her movement was smooth, unhurried, completely natural. But the distance between us narrowed more than it should have. Her shoulder came close to mine, just enough to register, not enough to feel deliberate. And yet, I became aware of everything at once. The fabric of her sleeve, the faint scent she carried, the way her voice lowered slightly as she explained something. I should have focused on the task. Instead, I found myself noticing her pauses. There were moments when she would stop speaking mid-thought, just briefly, like she was choosing her words more carefully than before. And sometimes, her gaze would linger on me. Not intense, but reflective, as if she was measuring something she hadn't fully decided how to interpret. Then came the moment that stayed with me longer than it should have. We were alone for a short while, just a brief gap between tasks, between interruptions. The kind of silence that feels heavier when shared with one other person. She sat nearby, not directly facing me at first. There was a softness in her posture now that I hadn't seen before. Less formality, less distance. At one point, she started to say something more personal, I could feel in the way her tone shifted, but she stopped halfway. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. She looked away for a moment, as if reconsidering. That pause felt louder than words. I didn't ask what she was going to say. I didn't interrupt the silence. I just stayed still, aware that something had almost been shared, and then carefully pulled back. When she finally spoke again, it was about something ordinary, safe, controlled. But the moment didn't disappear, because now I knew something was there between us that didn't exist in words yet. And worse, I wasn't sure she was the only one holding it back anymore. The shift didn't happen loudly. It never does, not when emotions are real. It came on an ordinary day that started like all the others, quiet, structured, predictable. But there was a difference I couldn't immediately name, a kind of tension in the air that wasn't about the work or the place or even the people around us. It was her. She noticed it before I did. I could tell from the way her gaze landed on me the moment I entered the room. Not sharp, not intrusive, but attentive in a way that felt immediate. Like she could read the change in me before I had fully acknowledged it myself. Something had happened earlier that day. A small frustration, a misunderstanding. Nothing dramatic on the surface, but stayed with me longer than it should have. I thought I was hiding it well. I wasn't. At first, she didn't say anything. She simply observed. That quiet, steady way she had of looking at things. Not rushing to conclusions, not filling silence unnecessarily. Just noticing. Then when the moment allowed it, she stepped closer. Not suddenly, not dramatically. Just enough that the space between us changed again. Her voice came softer this time. "Are you all right?" Simple words. But the tone carried something more. Concern, yes, but also recognition. Like she already knew the answer and was only giving me the dignity of speaking it myself. I tried to brush it off. A small nod. A short response. Something casual. But my voice didn't fully cooperate. There was something in my chest that still hadn't settled. And she noticed that too. Without saying anything further, she moved slightly closer. Her presence felt warmer now, less distant than before. There was no pressure in her movement, no insistence, just quiet intention. Then she did something small. She placed her hand on my arm. It wasn't a strong grip. It wasn't meant to hold me in place. It was grounding, gentle. Her palm rested lightly, steady enough that I could feel the warmth of it through the fabric, calm enough that it didn't feel intrusive. But it changed everything about the moment. The frustration I had been carrying didn't disappear, but it softened, like it had been acknowledged without needing to be explained. Her eyes stayed on mine for a few seconds longer than usual. Not searching, not questioning, just present. And in that stillness, I became aware of something else. How close we were standing, how quiet the room felt, how easily time seemed to slow when she wasn't speaking. I could hear my own breathing more clearly than the environment around us. Then she spoke again, her voice lower now, almost careful. "You don't have to pretend everything is fine all the time." The words weren't dramatic. There was no intensity in them, but they landed with a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Because it wasn't just advice. It felt personal, like she wasn't talking to the situation, but to me. My gaze dropped for a moment. I didn't know what to say. Not because I didn't understand her, but because I did, and that made it harder. Her hand stayed on my arm a little longer than necessary. Not enough to feel like a gesture, enough to feel like support. And then, almost reluctantly, she withdrew it. But the absence didn't feel like distance. It felt like awareness. Like something had been acknowledged between us that couldn't be undone. When she turned slightly away to resume what she was doing, I realized something quietly unsettling. It wasn't just that she had comforted me. It was that I had wanted her to stay like that a little longer, and I wasn't sure when that desire had started. It happened later than usual, when the day had already started to lose its structure and everything felt quieter, softer, almost suspended in time. The kind of evening where conversations naturally slow down and even the smallest sounds feel more noticeable than they should. We were alone again. Not completely by plan, but not by accident either. Circumstances had simply narrowed the space around us until there were no interruptions left to hide behind. At first, neither of us spoke. That silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore, not like it might have been in the beginning. It felt familiar now, like something we had both learned to exist inside without needing to fill it immediately. She sat beside me, not across, not at a distance, beside me, close enough that I could feel her presence more than see it, close enough that even the smallest movement from her shifted the air between us. Her posture was different tonight, less formal, still composed, but slightly softened at the edges, like she had let go of something heavy earlier in the day and hadn't fully rebuilt the wall around herself yet. I noticed the small things first. The way her hands rested in her lap instead of being neatly controlled as usual. The way she exhaled slowly before looking down at nothing in particular. The way her shoulder occasionally leaned just a fraction closer than necessary. We didn't talk at first. We just existed in that shared quiet. At one point, I adjusted my position slightly, and our shoulders brushed. It wasn't intentional, but neither of us moved away immediately. That single point of contact lingered longer than it should have, like neither of us wanted to acknowledge it too quickly and break whatever fragile balance had formed between us. She eventually spoke, her voice softer than before. Not about anything important, not about work, not about the usual structure of conversation, just something simple. But even the simplicity felt different now, because her tone wasn't performing confidence anymore. It wasn't instructing, correcting, or guiding. It was personal. At some point, she leaned slightly closer, not dramatically, not consciously, but in a way that made her presence feel closer than the space allowed. She reached out briefly, adjusting something small near me. My sleeve, my collar, something trivial, but her finger stayed there for just a second longer than necessary. That moment stretched. Her eyes lifted and met mine. This time, neither of us looked away immediately. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't avoidance either. It was recognition, like something unspoken had finally become too clear to pretend wasn't there. The air between us felt different now, thicker, quieter, more aware of itself. Even the silence seemed to pause, as if it understood it was holding something important. I could feel my thoughts slowing down, becoming less organized, less defensive. And I had the strange awareness that she might be feeling something similar, though she was far better at hiding it. Then, just as the moment reached its peak without crossing any line, she broke it gently. Not abruptly, not awkwardly, just softly turning her gaze away, as if choosing restraint over impulse. She changed the subject. Something ordinary again, but the shift didn't erase what had just happened. It only contained it, because now I knew something clearly. This wasn't accidental anymore. Whatever existed between us was being held back, carefully, deliberately. And for the first time, I wasn't sure whether she was the one doing all the holding. It didn't break all at once. It unfolded slowly, like something that had been held under pressure for too long, finally finding small cracks to breathe through. The atmosphere between us had already changed in ways neither of us had fully named yet. But today, there was no space left to avoid it. She arrived quieter than usual, not in a withdrawn way, but in a controlled stillness that immediately told me something was different. Her usual composure was there, but softened, like she had spent the day carrying thoughts heavier than she wanted to show. When she sat down near me, there was no immediate conversation, just a pause, a shared silence that felt more intentional than before. And then she spoke. Not about work, not about anything surface level. This time it was personal. Her voice carried a different rhythm, slower, more careful, like she was stepping into unfamiliar territory without a map. She spoke about expectations, about how life doesn't always leave space for honesty, about how people learn to appear strong even when they are not. I listened without interrupting, because something in her tone didn't invite interruption. It invited understanding. At one point, her gaze lowered slightly as she continued speaking, and I noticed something I hadn't seen clearly before, the fatigue behind her confidence. Not physical exhaustion, but emotional weight, the kind that comes from holding yourself together for too long. There was a moment where she paused mid-sentence, just a small break in her voice. Her fingers lightly touched the edge of the table, then stopped, as if she had forgotten what she was about to say. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full full of things she hadn't said yet. I didn't rush her, and maybe that was why she continued. Her words became more vulnerable now, less structured, less guarded. She admitted, carefully, indirectly, that there were moments in her life where she felt unseen despite being surrounded by people. That strength, over time, can become a kind of isolation. When she finally looked at me again, it felt different. Not searching for answers, just being honest in front of someone without controlling the outcome. Then something shifted between us. She leaned slightly closer while speaking, unconsciously, not dramatically, just enough that the space between us felt smaller than before. Her presence wasn't assertive now. It was human, real, unguarded in a way I hadn't witnessed from her before. And in that moment, something inside me responded without thinking. I reached out gently. My hand covered hers on the table. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't uncertain. It was steady, but careful, like I was aware that this gesture carried more meaning than either of us had spoken aloud. She didn't pull away. That was the first silence that changed everything. Her fingers remained still for a second, then slowly, subtly, responded. Not gripping, not holding tightly, just acknowledging. A quiet acceptance. Her eyes lifted toward mine again. This time, the silence between us wasn't defensive or uncertain. It was honest, completely unfiltered in a way neither of us had allowed before. I could see it in her expression, the realization that something had crossed from emotional distance into emotional presence. Not declared, not named, but undeniably there. And for the first time, neither of us tried to step back from it immediately. We just stayed there, connected through something neither of us had planned to feel, but both of us had already begun to carry. The final meeting didn't feel like a climax anymore. It felt like understanding. Whatever had been building between us over time, through silence, through pauses, through moments neither of us fully named, had already reached its natural conclusion. There was nothing left to chase, nothing left to hide behind. Only clarity remained. She was the first to break the silence, but not in a way that disturbed it. Her voice was calm, softer than I had ever heard it before, carrying the weight of someone speaking honestly rather than carefully. We didn't circle around things anymore. She acknowledged it first, not in dramatic words, not in confession, but in truth. She admitted that what had formed between us was real, but not simple. Not something that could be ignored, and not something that could be pursued without consequence. There was no confusion in her tone, only acceptance. I listened quietly, feeling the full weight of what she meant without needing it explained further. When I spoke, my voice was steady but low. I didn't try to convince her of anything. I didn't try to pull the moment in a different direction. I simply admitted what had already been obvious between us for some time, that I felt it too. But even as I said it, I understood something important. Feeling something doesn't always mean it can be lived the same way. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was honest. She looked at me for a long moment, not with hesitation, not with regret, but with a calm kind of sadness that comes when two people understand each other fully, but also understand the limits of timing, responsibility, and life outside of emotion. Her hand moved slightly, resting near mine on the table. Not holding, just close. That closeness said more than words could at that point. There was no denial between us anymore. No confusion left to resolve. Only the quiet reality that what we had shared existed, but existed in a space that couldn't fully become something more without breaking other parts of life around it. And strangely, that realization didn't feel like loss in the way I expected. It felt like maturity, like understanding something completely, even if it couldn't be continued. At some point, she exhaled softly, almost like she was letting go of something she had been carrying for a long time. Not of me, but of the tension that had surrounded everything between us. Then she stood slightly, adjusting herself with that same quiet grace she always had. But this time, there was no emotional distance behind it. Just closure. Before leaving, there was a final moment. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just human. She stepped closer and placed a brief, gentle embrace around me. Her arms were light but steady, her presence warm, her head tilting slightly as it rested near my shoulder for a moment. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't possessive. It was grounding. A gesture that didn't ask for anything to continue, but acknowledged everything that had been felt. I returned the embrace naturally, without hesitation, but without trying to hold it longer than it needed to be. When she stepped back, her expression carried something peaceful now. Not excitement, not regret, just acceptance. A small, genuine smile appeared, soft, quiet, real. And I realized then that this was the ending we were both choosing without saying it out loud. Not because nothing existed between us, but because what existed had been understood completely. As she walked away, there was no emptiness left behind. Only a calm space where something meaningful had been and would remain, not as longing, but as memory. And in that silence, I finally understood something simple. Some connections aren't meant to continue forward. They're meant to be felt fully and then gently let go.